George Brooks arrived at the lawyer's office wearing a watch that cost more than most people could afford. He sat in the mahogany chair, legs crossed, already mentally spending the inheritance he was certain was coming his way. Beside him, his sister, Vanessa, was checking her reflection in her phone, and their other brother, Cole, was already on his phone searching for a realtor. To them, their father, Richard, had been nothing more than a quiet, stubborn bank, a man who lived simply so they could live loudly. George looked at his younger sister, Claire, sitting in the corner in her off brand coat, and he felt a flicker of pity. He actually thought she was a fool for never asking for a loan while the vault was still open. George didn't know it yet, but he wasn't there to collect a fortune. He was there for a 20-year financial audit of his own greed. And Richard Brooks had kept every receipt. Claire Brooks learned early that silence made people underestimate you. In her family, it had been mistaken for weakness for so long that correcting the assumption felt unnecessary. Let them believe it, she thought. Let them overlook her. It was easier that way. Her siblings never did. George, the oldest, had left home at 19 with a loan from their father to get on his feet. He never paid it back. No one ever expected him to. He talked loudly, argued confidently, and treated their father like an inconvenience once he'd gotten what he wanted. Vanessa, the middle child, had received help in smaller but constant ways. Rent covered here, credit cards paid off there, a car bought outright when hers suddenly died. She showed up when it suited her, left when it didn't, and always had an explanation ready. Then there was Cole, the youngest, who had borrowed against their father's small construction business to invest in a startup that quietly failed. He rarely answered calls afterwards. When he did, it was brief and transactional. And then there was Claire. She had never asked for money, not because she didn't need help at times, but because she understood something her siblings didn't. Asking came with conditions, and she didn't want to owe anyone anything she couldn't repay. Their father, Richard Brooks, noticed this long before anyone else, but he never said it out loud, at least not then. The first time Claire realized how different her relationship with her father was, she was 24 and sitting across from him at a diner just off the highway. He'd insisted on meeting her there, halfway between her apartment and his house, claiming the pancakes were worth the drive. He ordered for both of them without asking. You still like blueberry? He said. Claire smiled. I do. He stirred cream into his coffee slowly, eyes tired but sharp. Your brother called. Claire didn't ask which one. She didn't need to. He needs money, Richard continued, not unkindly. Again. Claire nodded. Are you going to give it to him? Richard sighed. Probably. Claire didn't react. Richard watched her closely. You could ask too, you know. She met his eyes. I'm okay. He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. I know, he said. That was the entire conversation. But something about it stayed with her. The pattern had been clear for years, even if no one acknowledged it. When Richard was healthy, the siblings' involvement with him came in bursts. Holidays, emergencies, moments when guilt flickered briefly before fading again. They called him difficult when he asked for help. They called him stubborn when he refused to bend. They called him dramatic when he mentioned feeling lonely. Claire never did. She visited quietly, helped with small things, fixed what needed fixing without making a show of it. She didn't correct him when he repeated stories or forgot dates. She didn't rush him when he moved slowly. She just showed up. And over time, she became the one he expected. When Richard first got sick, it wasn't dramatic, just a persistent cough. Fatigue he brushed off, a doctor's appointment he postponed twice. Claire was the one who finally drove him. She sat beside him in the sterile exam room, legs crossed, hands folded in her lap, while the doctor explained the test results carefully. Claire watched her father's face, not for panic, but for resignation. Later, in the parking lot, Richard leaned against his truck and exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that's inconvenient. Claire smiled faintly. We'll figure it out. And they did, together. The siblings reacted exactly as Claire expected. George called and swore loudly about doctors and hospitals, then disappeared for weeks. Vanessa cried on the phone, promised to visit, and never followed through. Cole sent a text. Let me know if things get bad. Claire didn't confront them. She didn't need to. Their absence spoke loudly enough. As the months passed, Claire's role shifted without discussion. She became the one managing appointments, the one sorting medications, the one who noticed when the house felt too quiet or the fridge too empty. Richard never asked her to do those things. He simply trusted that she would. One evening, while she was organizing paperwork at his kitchen table, she came across an old folder tucked behind a drawer. Inside were loan agreements, names she recognized instantly: George, Vanessa, Cole. Dates stretched back decades, amounts circled in red, notes written in Richard's careful handwriting. Helped with condo down payment, paid off credit card, again, business loan, no repayment plan. Claire stared at the papers for a long time. She hadn't known the full extent before, not because it was hidden, but because she'd never asked. She slid the folder back into the drawer without mentioning it. That night, Richard sat across from her at the table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between them. You know, he said quietly, they'll all come back when I'm gone. Claire looked up. What? He shrugged. For things, for answers, for fairness. Claire frowned. You're not gone. He smiled, tired but knowing. Not yet. She hesitated. You don't owe anyone anything. Richard chuckled softly. I've already given them everything they asked for. Claire didn't respond. She didn't need to. Later, as she drove home, Claire thought about that folder again, about the money already spent, the help already given, the care that had gone unreciprocated. She thought about how quiet loyalty never looked impressive from the outside, and how, one day, silence would be mistaken for theft. She didn't know yet how loud that accusation would be, only that when it came, she would be ready. By the second year of Richard Brooks' illness, Claire could tell what kind of day it would be by the sound of his footsteps. Some mornings he shuffled, deliberate, like his body needed a moment to remember itself. Other mornings he moved with irritation, sharp steps, too much force, as if anger could drag strength out of him. Claire learned not to ask how he was feeling. She watched instead. The way his fingers trembled when he poured coffee, the way he paused at the top of the stairs like he'd forgotten why he'd climbed them, the way he tried to hide the cough behind a clear throat like pride could make it smaller. On paper, she still had her own life, a job, an apartment, friends she texted more than she saw. But in reality, her schedule belonged to her father now. Not because he demanded it. Richard wasn't built for demands. But because everything in him unraveled quietly without someone steady nearby. Claire was that steadiness. She came by after work to check his medications. She sat with him during appointments, writing notes he pretended not to need. She learned the language of lab results and insurance calls, the delicate dance of advocating without humiliating him. When Richard's doctor started talking about long-term planning, Claire felt her stomach drop, even though she'd known it was coming. Later in the parking lot, Richard leaned against his truck and stared at the hospital entrance like it had offended him. They love turning people into paperwork, he muttered. Claire squeezed his arm lightly. You're still you. Richard's mouth tightened, but he nodded. And then he asked, almost casually, Did you call your brother? Claire hesitated. Not yet. Richard exhaled, the sound sharp with disappointment he didn't want to own. Don't bother. Claire blinked. What do you mean? He didn't look at her. I've already bothered them enough. The siblings didn't vanish all at once. They faded. George was the easiest to predict because he was never subtle. He called only when something needed fixing, and he'd already decided someone else should fix it. When Claire updated him about Richard's treatment plan, George swore loudly into the phone. Of course, he snapped. Of course, this happens when I've got my own stuff going on. Claire stared at her father's medical folder, fingers tight around the edge. He's sick, George. I know he's sick, George snapped back. But what do you expect me to do? I'm 3 states away. Claire kept her voice even. You could call him. George exhaled like she'd ask for a kidney. He doesn't even like talking on the phone. He likes hearing from his children, Claire said quietly. George was silent for a beat, then dismissive. Fine. Tell him I love him. Claire held the phone away from her ear slightly, as if the distance could make that sentence less insulting. Tell him yourself, she said, and ended the call. Vanessa's neglect was different. She performed concern the way people perform grief, dramatic, sincere sounding, and ultimately empty. She called with breathless sympathy. Oh my God, poor dad, she'd say, voice trembling. I can't believe this. I'm coming this weekend. And then the weekend came. Something always happened. The kids got sick. Her job needed her. Her car was acting funny. The apologies were always fluent. The visits never happened. Cole, the youngest, didn't even bother with performance. His absence was clean. He texted instead of called, and every message looked like it had been written while he walked into a meeting. Let me know if he needs anything. Crazy week. Hope he's okay. Can't talk now. Claire learned not to respond right away. When she did, it was short. He has an appointment Tuesday. He needs help with groceries. He's asking about you. Cole's reply didn't match the weight. Damn, that sucks. Tell him I said hi, as if Richard were a neighbor, not their father. In the beginning, Richard defended them. They've got lives, he said, whenever Claire's jaw tightened. I don't want to be a burden. Claire would nod and let him believe that was the reason. But sometimes, late at night, when the pain medication made his voice softer, truth slipped out in fragments. I gave George everything, Richard said once, staring at the dark window, and he acts like I'm a bill collector. Claire didn't respond. Richard continued anyway, voice rough. Vanessa only loves people when it makes her feel good about herself. Claire looked down at her hands. And Cole, Richard muttered, bitterness creeping in. Cole's always been the one who runs. Claire breathed slowly. They're still your kids. Richard nodded. And you're the one who stayed. The sentence settled between them like something sacred and heavy. Claire hated how much she needed to hear it. The caregiver years weren't dramatic. They were repetitive in a way that made time blur. There were grocery runs, insurance calls, pills organized into plastic compartments. There were nights Claire sat on Richard's couch while he slept in his chair, the television flickering, the house too quiet. Sometimes she would look around and imagine her siblings here. George making jokes, Vanessa rearranging pillows, Cole actually sitting down. It never happened. And then slowly, Claire stopped imagining. The first time Claire realized her siblings were suspicious of her was during a group call. Richard's doctor had recommended a new round of treatment. Claire had texted her siblings to update them. Vanessa insisted they all talk together. They FaceTime on a Sunday. Claire's face appeared first, then Vanessa's bright smile stretched too wide. Cole's camera was angled at a ceiling fan. George didn't turn his camera on at all. Okay, Vanessa said brightly. So how's Dad really doing? Claire answered honestly. He's tired. Treatment is hard. George's voice cut in. Is he still, mentally okay? Claire's stomach tightened. He's himself. You sure? George pressed. Because you're there all the time. People get influenced. Claire blinked. Influenced? Vanessa's voice turned sweet. We're not accusing you, Claire. We just want to make sure everything is transparent. Transparent? Clara felt heat rise in her chest. I'm taking him to doctor's appointments. I'm not doing magic. Cole finally spoke, clipped. Just keep us updated. Claire stared at the screen. You could come, visit, see for yourselves. Silence. Then Vanessa sighed dramatically. You know we can't just drop everything, not like you. Claire's mouth went dry. Not like you. As if showing up were a luxury instead of a necessity. Richard's voice drifted from the other room. Who's on the phone? Claire muted the call before answering him. Your kids? Richard's face softened briefly. Tell them I love them. Claire turned back to the phone, unmuted, and repeated it. Vanessa smiled too brightly. Love you too, Dad. We miss you. George's voice rougher. Yeah, love you. Cole. Love you, Dad. The call ended quickly after that. And when the screen went dark, Claire sat very still, the silence in Richard's house suddenly louder. The suspicion lingered, not because Claire was doing anything wrong, but because it was easier for them to think she was manipulating him than to admit they had abandoned him. A week later, Richard asked Claire to drive him to his lawyer's office. She almost asked why, but something in his posture told her not to. He wore his good jacket, the one he used to wear to meetings when the business was healthy. He looked older in it now, like the jacket remembered a stronger man. In the car, Richard stared out the window. I'm getting things in order, he said finally. Claire's throat tightened. Dad? He lifted a hand, stopping her gently. Don't. Claire swallowed. Okay. Richard glanced at her. You've done enough. The words warmed her chest and broke it at the same time, because enough was never what her siblings had done. When they got to the lawyer's office, Claire waited in the lobby. She listened to muffled voices behind the closed door. Richard's voice low and steady, the lawyer's voice calm. Claire stared at the framed certificates on the wall and felt her heart thudding slowly. She didn't know what Richard was deciding in there, but she knew this. Whatever he chose, her siblings would not accept it quietly. And the quieter Claire remained, the louder they would become. Richard Brooks's decline wasn't sudden. That was the cruel part. It happened in inches instead of miles, small enough that denial felt reasonable, slow enough that people could pretend there would be more time. Claire noticed first when he stopped correcting her. He'd always been particular about tools, about paperwork, about the way things were done. Even when he was sick, he had opinions. Then, one afternoon, while she was helping him sort invoices from the business he still technically owned, she made a mistake. She filed a receipt in the wrong folder. Richard glanced at it, frowned slightly, and said nothing. Claire froze. You usually hate that, she said carefully. He shrugged. Doesn't matter much anymore. The sentence landed heavier than anything a doctor had said. From that point on, Claire stopped leaving him alone for long stretches. She rearranged her work schedule, took calls in the driveway, ate dinners at odd hours, slept lightly, always listening for movement down the hall. She didn't announce these changes to her siblings. She didn't need to. They noticed anyway. Not because they cared, but because her presence removed their excuse. The first time George reappeared in person was 3 months later. He didn't come quietly. He came loud, impatient, already irritated before he stepped through the door. The house felt different with him in it, tense, disrupted, like a stranger had wandered into something sacred. George stood in the living room, arms crossed, scanning the place. So, he said, this is how Dad's living now? Claire set down a glass of water carefully. He's comfortable. George scoffed. Comfortable or controlled? Claire looked up sharply. What does that mean? George shrugged. I don't know. You're here all the time. You don't think that affects him? Richard sat in his chair, watching silently. Claire felt heat rise in her chest. I'm here because he needs help. George snorted. Or because you want to be. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Richard cleared his throat. That's enough. George waved his hand dismissively. I'm just saying, you disappear for years, Claire, then suddenly you're running everything. Claire stared at him. I didn't disappear. You did. George's jaw tightened. You don't get to rewrite history. Claire laughed softly. And neither do you. George left that night without saying goodbye. He didn't hug their father. He didn't ask how to help. But 2 days later, he called Vanessa, and the story began to spread. Vanessa's concern arrived wrapped in sweetness. She called Claire one evening, voice low and careful. I'm worried, she said. Claire leaned against the kitchen counter. About what? About Dad, Vanessa replied, and about you. Claire closed her eyes. You haven't visited in over a year. That's not fair, Vanessa snapped, sweetness gone. You know I have kids. So do other people, Claire said evenly. Vanessa inhaled sharply. You're being defensive. I'm being honest. Vanessa paused, then shifted tactics. George says Dad's confused lately. Claire's stomach tightened. Confused how? Well, influenced, Vanessa said carefully. People can get dependent, especially when one person is always around. There it was. Claire felt a cold clarity settle in her chest. You think I'm manipulating him? She said. Vanessa laughed nervously. No, I didn't say that. You didn't have to, Claire replied. Vanessa sighed dramatically. I just think we should all be more involved. And you're welcome to be, Claire said. Any time. Silence. Then Vanessa muttered, You know that's not what I meant. Claire ended the call without responding. The business became the next battleground. Richard's construction company wasn't large, but it was steady. It had kept food on the table and roofs over their heads for decades. Claire had grown up around it. Invoices spread across the kitchen table, late night calls, the hum of responsibility that never really shut off. As Richard weakened, the day-to-day decisions quietly fell to her. She didn't want them to, but someone had to sign checks. Someone had to answer emails. Someone had to keep projects from stalling. She did it carefully, transparently. She documented everything because she could feel the suspicion sharpening. Cole was the first to bring it up outright. He called late one night, voice clipped. So you're running the business now? Claire sighed. I'm keeping it afloat. Cole laughed. Funny how that happened. Claire straightened. What's that supposed to mean? You're in control of Dad, the house, the business, Cole said. That looks convenient. Claire's voice dropped. You borrowed against the company and never paid it back. Cole went quiet. That's different, he muttered. It's not, Claire replied. Cole snapped. You think you're the only one who sacrificed? Claire closed her eyes. I think I'm the only one who stayed, she said. The line went dead. Richard heard pieces of it. Not the full accusations. Claire shielded him from those, but enough. One night, after a tense phone call she stepped outside to take, Richard looked at her with something close to shame. They think you're taking advantage of me, he said quietly. Claire's chest ached. I would never. I know, he replied immediately, but they don't. He stared down at his hands. They never have. Claire sat beside him, the couch creaking under their combined weight. You didn't fail them, she said. Richard shook his head. I failed to teach them gratitude. They sat in silence for a long time. The next time Vanessa visited, she brought a witness, her husband. He hovered awkwardly in the doorway while Vanessa surveyed the house. This place needs updating, she said lightly. Have you thought about selling? Claire's spine stiffened. That's not going anywhere. Vanessa smiled thinly. I'm just being practical. Richard watched from his chair, eyes sharp despite his fatigue. This is my home, he said. I'll die in it. Vanessa's smile faltered. Dad, and Claire's been taking care of it, Richard continued. better than anyone. Vanessa shifted like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Of course, we just want to make sure everything's fair. Fair. Claire almost laughed. After they left, Richard asked Claire to bring him his old ledger, the one he'd kept before everything went digital. She handed it to him, watching as he flipped through pages filled with careful handwriting. He tapped a page with his finger. They'll say you manipulated me, he said quietly. Claire swallowed. I know. Richard closed the book. That's why I've been keeping records. Claire's breath caught. Records of what? She asked. Richard looked at her steadily. Everything I've already given them. Claire felt a chill run through her. Not fear, anticipation. Because she understood now. This wasn't just about money. It was about truth. And truth, once spoken, was going to tear the family apart. Richard Brooks died on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't dramatic. There were no last words that tied things up neatly, no final speeches that softened the truth. The nurse called Claire just after 6, voice low and practiced, telling her it was peaceful, that he hadn't been in pain, that he'd gone quietly. Claire sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after she hung up, phone resting in her lap, the room still dark, quiet. That was how he lived his life toward the end, too. Quietly enduring, quietly noticing, quietly preparing. She drove to the house before the sun fully rose. The porch light was still on, the way she'd left it the night before. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee. The house felt hollow already, like it had known before she did. She sat with him for a while, held his hand, thanked him out loud for things she'd never said when he was alive. Not because she didn't feel them, but because she'd assumed there would be time. When she finally stood, her legs felt unsteady, like grief had weight. The nurse asked gently, Would you like me to contact your family? Claire nodded. I'll call them. They reappeared immediately. George was the first to call her back. What? He said, breathless. When? This morning, Claire replied. There was a pause. Not grief, not shock. Was anyone else there? He asked. Claire's jaw tightened. I was. Another pause. Of course you were. She ended the call without responding. Vanessa arrived 2 hours later, eyes red, face carefully arranged into sorrow. She hugged Claire stiffly, pulling back quickly. Oh my God, she whispered. This is so sudden. Claire said nothing. Cole showed up that afternoon, sunglasses on, phone in hand. He hugged his father's empty chair instead of Claire. I can't believe this, he muttered. I just talked to him a few weeks ago. Claire didn't correct him. The house filled with noise quickly. Voices, footsteps, the clatter of dishes as if activity could fill the space where Richard had been. Claire moved through it all quietly. She answered practical questions, found documents, made calls. She didn't cry yet. She was still in doing mode. The funeral was small, by Richard's request. No long speeches, no dramatics. Claire sat in the front row alone. Her siblings sat together, whispering occasionally, glancing at her when they thought she wasn't looking. People approached Claire afterward. You took such good care of him, one woman said, squeezing her hand. George stiffened nearby. Another man clapped Claire gently on the shoulder. He was lucky to have you. Vanessa's smile tightened. Claire noticed. She noticed everything. The shift happened before the will was even read. It happened in the kitchen the night after the funeral. Claire stood at the sink, rinsing a mug, when George spoke from behind her. So, he said, what happens now? Claire didn't turn around. We meet with Dad's lawyer next week. George scoffed. Figures. She sat the mug down carefully. What does that mean? It means you've been very involved, he replied. Convenient timing. Claire turned slowly. Say what you want to say. George crossed his arms. You were the last one with him. You controlled everything. You don't think that looks suspicious? Vanessa leaned against the counter, arms folded. We're not accusing you, she said lightly. Claire met her eyes. You are. Cole shifted uncomfortably. We just want transparency. Claire laughed softly, humorless. You had years to be transparent. George's voice rose. Don't act like a saint. You benefited from this. The word benefited echoed in the kitchen. Claire felt something cold settle in her chest. You mean I showed up, she said. That's what you're saying. George stepped closer. You isolated him. Claire just stared at him. You abandoned him. The room went quiet. Vanessa scoffed. See, she's emotional. Claire exhaled slowly. Get out. George laughed. You don't get to kick us out of Dad's house. Claire looked around the kitchen, the place she'd cleaned, stocked, kept alive while they lived elsewhere. You don't get to rewrite the last years of his life, she said. They left shortly after, anger simmering, conclusions already drawn. Claire stood alone in the kitchen long after the door closed. And finally, she cried. The lawyer's office was quiet and neutral. Beige walls, framed certificates, a box of tissues placed deliberately within reach. Claire sat alone at one side of the table. Her siblings sat together on the other. Claire realized they weren't coming to grieve, they were coming to audit. The lawyer cleared his throat. As you know, your father updated his will 2 years ago. George leaned forward immediately. Claire felt her pulse steady. She had expected this. The majority of the estate, the lawyer continued, has been left to Claire Brooks. Silence. Then chaos. George stood abruptly. That's impossible. Vanessa laughed, sharp and disbelieving. This is a joke. Cole leaned forward. She manipulated him. The lawyer raised a hand. Please. This is theft, George snapped. She got in his head. Claire sat very still. The lawyer opened a folder calmly. Your father anticipated this reaction, he said. He slid documents across the table. Loan records, gift agreements, forgiven debts, dates, amounts, names. George went pale. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. Cole stared at the paper like it had personally betrayed him. Your father kept meticulous records, the lawyer continued. He wanted it noted that each of you had already received significant financial support over the years. George slammed his hand on the table. That doesn't mean. It means, the lawyer said evenly, that this was intentional. He slid another folder forward. The business, the house, letters. Claire hadn't known about the letters. Her breath caught. She was there, Vanessa hissed. Of course he chose her. The lawyer met her gaze calmly. He chose the person who stayed. The room felt very small, very exposed. Outside the office, the explosion continued. George accused. Vanessa cried. Cole shouted about fairness. Claire didn't engage. She listened, and for the first time, she heard them clearly. Not as siblings, as strangers who believed love was transactional. She walked away while they were still arguing. She didn't look back. That night, alone in her father's house, Claire opened the envelope marked for Claire. Inside were letters written in Richard's careful handwriting. You were never loud, but you were always present. I wanted you to have what you earned. Peace. They'll be angry. Let them be. You did nothing wrong. Claire pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. For the first time since his death, her grief felt clean. Claire didn't argue with them after the will reading. That surprised everyone, including herself. She didn't raise her voice when George shouted about theft. She didn't flinch when Vanessa cried and accused her of manipulation. She didn't respond when Cole muttered that she had always been calculated. She listened. And in listening, she finally understood something that had eluded her entire life. They were not grieving their father. They were grieving access. The fallout came fast. George was the first to demand a reevaluation. He called the lawyer 3 times in one day, voice escalating with every attempt, insisting the will had been influenced, that Claire had isolated Richard, that the documents were misleading, incomplete, manipulated. By the fourth call, the lawyer stopped answering. Instead, they all received a single email. No greeting, no explanation, just attachments. Loan agreements, forgiven debt, canceled checks, notes written in Richard's handwriting, dated, signed, and meticulous. George's name appeared first. $85,000, condo down payment, gifted outright. $42,000, credit card balances paid off over multiple years. $18,000, temporary loan following his divorce, never repaid. $9,500, legal fees covered after he threatened to sue an employer. At the bottom of the page, a total was circled neatly in red. $154,500, more than the value of the house's remaining equity, more than the business was worth at the time of Richard's death. George called it ancient history. He did not dispute a single charge. Vanessa's records followed. Hers were quieter, more frequent, the kind of help that never looked dramatic on its own, but accumulated relentlessly over time. $1,200 per month for 3 years, rent assistance during transitions. $28,000, car purchased outright after repossession. $11,400, recurring credit card bailouts. $8,000, child care expenses during a rough patch. Total, $90,600. Vanessa cried when she read it, not out of shame, out of fury, because she still believed she deserved more. Cole's was shorter than the others, but heavier. Attached was a business ledger, the loan he'd taken against their father's construction company. $112,000, startup capital. $0 repaid. Debt forgiven to preserve family peace. Cole insisted it didn't count. The business had survived after all. No one needed to remind him that it had survived because Claire kept it running while he disappeared. Then there was Claire's. One sentence. No prior financial assistance recorded. The contrast was brutal. At the end of the email, the lawyer included a final note. Your father was explicit. The distribution was not punitive, it was corrective. That word ignited them. Corrective implied imbalance. Imbalance implied truth. George stopped calling after that, not because he understood, but because there was nothing left to argue with. The numbers had spoken, and for the first time in their lives, the silence belonged to Claire, not as absence, but as proof. Vanessa tried a different approach. She called Claire late one evening, voice trembling with emotion that felt practiced. I just want to talk, Vanessa said. Sister to sister. Claire stood in her father's living room, phone pressed to her ear, surrounded by silence she no longer found threatening. I don't think there's anything left to say, Claire replied. Vanessa sniffed. You don't understand how hurt we are. Claire closed her eyes. You accused me of manipulating a dying man. Vanessa's voice sharpened. Because you were always there. Yes, Claire said simply. That doesn't mean you get everything. It means he chose, Claire replied, and that choice wasn't about money. Vanessa exhaled sharply. You always think you're morally superior. Claire smiled faintly. No, I just stopped apologizing for staying. Vanessa hung up on her. Claire didn't call back. Cole's anger was quieter and more destructive. Without Claire quietly managing the business in the background, things unraveled quickly. Invoices went unpaid, clients noticed delays, a long-term contract fell through when no one returned calls. Cole tried to step in, claiming he knew how things worked. He didn't. Within months, the business was bleeding money. The irony wasn't lost on Claire. Cole had once borrowed against the company and walked away without consequence. Now, without Claire's steady hand, the thing he'd assumed would always exist collapsed under his own inattention. He blamed her anyway. Of course he did. The sibling story about Claire solidified in their absence from her life. She planned this, George told anyone who would listen. She played the long game, Vanessa said bitterly. She turned him against us, Cole muttered. Extended family listened politely. Some nodded, some didn't. But no one challenged the receipt, because receipts don't care about feelings. They cared about facts. Claire moved slowly after everything settled. She didn't rush into decisions. She sat in her father's house, surrounded by decades of his life, and let herself grieve properly for the first time. She read the letters again. Each one was short, thoughtful, unapologetic. I saw what you did even when no one else did. You never asked. That mattered. This is not a punishment. It's a recognition. Claire cried over those words. Not from guilt, from relief. She sold the business quietly once it was stabilized enough to hand over responsibly. She kept the house, not because it was valuable, though it was, but because it felt like grounding. She donated some of the money, saved the rest. She built a life that didn't require justification. The last time she saw her siblings was almost a year later. It happened by accident in a grocery store parking lot. George looked older, angrier, smaller somehow. Vanessa avoided her gaze entirely. Cole lingered, like he wanted to say something, but didn't know how to start. Claire nodded once, polite, distant. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Everything that could be said had already been written down. That night, Claire sat on her porch with a cup of tea, the air cool and still. She'd thought about the years she'd spent being overlooked, the quiet care, the steady presence. She thought about how easily silence was mistaken for weakness, and how loudly people protested when that silence finally withdrew. Claire smiled softly to herself. Her father had been right. They had come back for things, and she had walked away with peace. Richard Brooks spent 20 years keeping a ledger of his children's greed so that his daughter wouldn't have to spend a single day wondering if she was enough. But it makes me wonder, is it ever truly fair for a parent to leave everything to one child? Or did George and the others get exactly what they deserve? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next tale.